Fairly or unfairly, history remembers George McClellan as one of the worst generals of the Civil War. Whether that was stories of how McClellan was hesitant to engage with Lee's army during the Peninsula Campaign, or how McClellan epically failed in the Battle of Antietam, or my personal favorite McClellan story, which was when Lincoln, Secretary of State Seward, and John Hay visited McClellan's house, and upon arriving, they heard that the general was at a wedding and would be back later in the night. For the next hour, Lincoln and his colleagues waited for McClellan to return, and when he finally did return, George McClellan literally did not acknowledge the president and went straight to bed. The point is, today George McClellan has become a meme to Civil War historians, but does he really deserve all the criticism? In today's In Defense of, I attempt to defend General George McClellan. But before I start, 98% of you watching my videos are not subscribed to the channel, and I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe so I can continue to make free original history content. Also, if you want to see my daily shorts, you can find them on my TikTok channel at History Channel Guy. Okay, self-promotion done. Let's dive into the Union's most memeable general, George McClellan. Part 1. The Peninsula Campaign. The common perception of McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign was the general was stupidly cautious. More specifically, McClellan kept his army in Yorktown and conducted siege warfare to a Confederate army that was one-fifth his size. Moreover, it is also claimed that McClellan vastly overestimated the amount of troops that the Confederacy had at their disposal, and constantly asked for reinforcements without the need for them. McClellan is also criticized for not pursuing the Confederates quick enough when they finally retreated to Richmond. And finally, historians have also criticized McClellan for withholding troops from General John Pope because Pope was McClellan's political opponent. However, is it fair to completely blame McClellan for these failures, or should we consider other players who made mistakes, namely President Abraham Lincoln? At the start of the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan told President Lincoln his plan to capture Richmond. Originally, McClellan would send his forces down the Chesapeake Bay to the peninsula between the York and James rivers, and there he'd be able to assault Richmond. Simultaneously, McClellan's men would defend Washington by manning the forts surrounding Washington and guard the Piedmont and the head of the Shenandoah Valley. At the beginning of the campaign, McClellan had 190,000 men at his disposal, but there's much disagreement as to how many men were to defend Washington. Originally, McClellan's officers recommended that he leave 55,000 men to defend Washington, while 135,000 should be allocated to capture Richmond. However, Lincoln was deeply concerned with the protection of Washington, and unbeknownst to McClellan, Lincoln held back 33,000 men to protect Washington, leaving McClellan with 102,000 men and not the expected 135,000. Lincoln's orders came after McClellan already wrote orders for these 33,000 men, and he was not aware of Lincoln's change until after he reached the front. Upon hearing Lincoln's order, McClellan was understandably upset. In a letter McClellan wrote to Lincoln, he begged him to release his troops, even saying, quote, "I beg that you will reconsider the order. The success of our cause will be imperiled by greatly reducing my force when it is actually under the first of the enemy and active operations have commenced." Lincoln would have none of it. In his reply, he said, quote, "You now have over 100,000 troops with you. I think you better break the enemy's lines from Yorktown to Warwick River at once." But that was not exactly true, because in reality, McClellan had 58,000 men at his disposal instead of the 135,000 he thought he would have. This is because many of his troops were still waiting to be transported from Washington. In a private letter to his wife, McClellan said that he wanted to tell Lincoln that he could break the Confederate lines himself. Though McClellan was misinformed of the size of the army, it is kinda understandable why he did not attack immediately with only 58,000 men. Defending Richmond was 11,000 Confederates who had a strong defensive position behind a swamp and a river. In fact, the only way to break the Confederate lines was to march through a 2-mile stretch of fortified land, which was guarded from 3 sides by heavy Confederate artillery. To make matters worse, McClellan's own heavy guns haven't even arrived yet. And yes, I know what you're thinking, but History Channel Guy, how can you defend this? McClellan still has 5 times the men. Well, yes, this might be true, but have you ever seen the movie 300? When you have a much smaller force, you can use the land to your advantage while maintaining a defensive advantage. There are countless examples of armies holding onto defensive positions and defeating armies much greater in size. The Battle of Agincourt is a famous example of an army holding a defensive position, winning with 5-1 odds. Another is the Battle of Rorke's Drift, where the British army held off a force of 20,000 Zulus with only 1,800 soldiers. I personally think If McClellan would have led his men into a full-on attack, he could have led tens of thousands of men into a slaughter. He probably would still win, but it would have been one of the bloodiest days in American history. So it kind of makes sense why McClellan would be so willing to conduct a siege warfare instead of a full-on assault. Over the next 2 weeks, the remainder of McClellan's men arrive, but so had 40,000 more Confederates, making McClellan's advantage go from 5-1 to 2-1. To make matters worse, McClellan later learned that 88,000 men left behind in Washington had been removed from his control and put under the direct command of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Though this might not sound like a big deal, trust me, it was. Edwin Stanton was a former attorney with no military experience. Oh, and guess what? This is not the only damage Stanton did. Later on, Stanton closed down all recruiting stations in the North, and for the next 3 months, every Union soldier who died would not be replaced. 4 days after Stanton made his order, the Union experienced over 13,000 losses at the Battle of Shiloh and over 70,000 over the course of Stanton's idiotic order. Simultaneously, when the North wasn't recruiting, the South went into overdrive recruiting soldiers. The Confederacy created a draft which prevented soldiers in the Confederate Army from leaving, and it brought most of the remaining Southern men between the ages of 18 to 35 into the Confederate Army. By May 4th, I would argue McClellan's siege tactics work, as the rebels were forced to retreat further south. McClellan and his 95,000 men continued their march towards Richmond. Simultaneously needing to defend the Confederate capital, Robert E. Lee shifted his troops from the Atlantic coast back into the Shenandoah Valley. According to Confederate records, Lee's army grew from 56,000 men to 115,000. Yep, you heard me correctly. According to Confederate records, Lee now had 20,000 more men than McClellan. Though I will acknowledge that McClellan was misinformed about where these reinforcements came from, as he believed they came from the Western Theater and not the Atlantic coast, which led McClellan to believe that he faced 200,000 men, but even still, 115,000 men in defensive positions with Robert E. Lee is certainly a formidable foe. After hearing of Lee's reinforcements, McClellan telegraphed Lincoln for reinforcements, and Lincoln eventually agreed to send 35,000 reinforcements, but only 10,000 would arrive to help McClellan. While McClellan was near Richmond, Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton made crucial mistakes by not taking advantage of the newly weakened Confederate positions. Instead of attacking the Atlantic coast, where Lee got his reinforcements from, Stanton ordered his men to pursue Stonewall Jackson's small army in the Shenandoah Valley. Some historians have even called the pursuit of Jackson's army as a glorified wild goose chase. General Irwin McDowell saw the foolishness of pursuing Jackson and even told President Lincoln that he should use his troops to reinforce McClellan in his attack of Richmond. Lincoln, again, would hear none of it, and eventually Stonewall Jackson's army would join Lee in defense of Richmond, all while 60,000 troops sat idly by while key Confederate holdings were ripe for the taking. Jackson's arrival meant doom for McClellan's attack of Richmond. Without reinforcements, McClellan's supply lines were exposed. Knowing this, Lee hammered McClellan's line back to James River between Richmond and Petersburg. If it wasn't for Union gunboats, it is extremely likely that McClellan's army would have been completely destroyed, but luckily he was able to retreat. After these embarrassments, Lincoln and Stanton gave up being military strategists and gave the role of General-in-Chief to General Henry Halleck. This would again be bad news for McClellan, as despite McClellan still being within striking distance of Richmond, Halleck rejected his suggestion that his army go south to take critical railroad junctions at Petersburg, Virginia. This was a huge blunder, and this exact same strategy would be used by General Grant 2 years later in the war to capture Richmond. On August 3rd, McClellan was ordered to withdraw from the peninsula and join General Pope's army. Lincoln and Halleck accused McClellan of stalling, but there were a lot of logistical nightmares McClellan had to go through while moving his army. For one, a large part of McClellan's army was still near Richmond, so they had to all be called back. Simultaneously, McClellan had to evacuate 12,500 sick men, but there were not enough transports for these men because they had already been transporting Confederate POWs, so they had to wait for those. And finally, McClellan's largest transport could not reach his army because the James River was too shallow. So just think about having all these logistical nightmares and then being accused of stalling. And to top that all off, you have to march 55 miles to port. While all these logistical nightmares were going on, Stonewall Jackson's men had slipped behind Pope's lines. McClellan sent his infantry before his artillery or cavalry because they did not take as long to move. However, as soon as 1,200 of McClellan's infantry arrived to reinforce Pope, Jackson's army is waiting for them with artillery. Keep in mind, McClellan's men did not have cannons, which made them sitting ducks for the rebels. Within hours, McClellan lost a quarter of his men, which made McClellan refuse to send the remainder of his forces into battle until his artillery arrived. Halleck then overruled McClellan and ordered his troops forward. After Pope was defeated, Lincoln returned the army to McClellan. So, does this sound like McClellan was ineffective and these losses were his fault, or were these losses because of the inexperience of Lincoln and Stanton and the ludicrous orders of General Halleck? Today, the Peninsula Campaign is known as a failure, but I just want you to think about it for a second. George McClellan was 6 miles away from the Confederate capital and he only lost 10,000 men. McClellan did this in the first year of the war, and the same feats would be tried and failed until Grant took over the army. Yet, Grant lost 6 times the amount of soldiers that McClellan did, and was fighting a rebel army that was half the size that McClellan fought, and was worn out by 2 years of fighting. Like, come on, you can't tell me that the army Grant fought was as formidable as the one McClellan fought. Near the end of the war, the Confederate army was running low on ammunition, food, and just about every other supply. Some soldiers didn't even wear shoes into battle. If you don't believe me, you can believe Robert E. Lee. When asked about which Union general he considered to be the greatest, Lee responded, "McClellan, by all odds." After the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee's army headed north, and McClellan was ordered to stop the invasion, which now leads me to Part 2. Part 2. Antietam. Historians remember McClellan's actions at the Battle of Antietam as a complete failure. Many historians assert that when McClellan acquired a copy of Lee's battle plans, that the general acted too slowly in attacking Lee. Moreover, they also claim that Lee only had 40,000 troops, while McClellan doubled his numbers with over 80,000 men. So, theoretically, a general knowing Lee's plans and having double his numbers should have decimated Lee's army, right? Well, it's not that simple. 2 weeks before the Battle of Antietam, McClellan was effectively a general without a command, as every unit under his control had been transferred to other generals. Many of McClellan's former soldiers were sent to aid General John Pope in his campaign against Lee at Manassas. However, Lee defeated Pope and his troops, and they retreated back to the capital, with Lee's army close behind. After this, Lincoln returned Pope's army to McClellan, hoping that being with their former commander would raise the troops' morale. Simultaneously, on September 1st, McClellan inherited 4 separate armies, most of which were filled with thousands of recruits which were not trained and had to be organized by inexperienced officers. To make matters worse for McClellan, 3 of his senior commanders had been relieved of duty because General John Pope charged them with insubordination. While McClellan was hastily organizing his men, General Lee was on the march into the north, more specifically into Maryland. The most likely part of the army to see Lee's movements were the U.S. cavalry, but McClellan had basically no cavalry at his disposal. On paper, McClellan should have commanded 28 cavalry regiments, but Manassas had decimated these units, while simultaneously a large portion of them remained in Hampton Roads. During the first week of the campaign, McClellan only had 1,500 cavalry from 2 regiments, and they were supposed to challenge 5,000 Confederate cavalry soldiers. Another aspect we rarely mention in regards to McClellan is the amount of untrained soldiers he had. 1/5 of McClellan's forces at Antietam were untrained, and they literally had to learn how to fire their muskets as they marched into battle. On September 13th, Union soldiers stumbled upon a 4-day-old copy of Lee's orders in an abandoned rebel camp. Infamously, Special Order Number 191 revealed that Lee had dangerously split his army into 5 parts. 3 columns converged on Harper's Ferry to capture the federal garrison there, and a 4th column was in Hagerstown, while a 5th acted as a rearguard in Boonesboro. It is indisputable that McClellan did see these orders, but what has been heavily debated was when Lee's lost orders were delivered to McClellan. According to historian Stephen Sears, McClellan verified that the orders were legitimate before noon, and he failed to move his army for 18 hours. Evidence that supports Sears' theory is a telegram that McClellan sent to Lincoln at 12 m. I know what you're thinking. What the heck does 12 m mean? Well, according to Sears, the M stands for meridian, which is another way of saying noon. In the telegram, McClellan boldly claims that, quote, "No time shall be lost in attacking Lee and his army." So, that's it, right? McClellan had his orders for hours and literally did nothing with them. Well, again, it's not that simple. Another Civil War historian named Maurice de Aus discovered the original telegram and it shows that the telegram was sent at midnight, not at noon. This is a full 12 hours after the original theory claimed that McClellan sent the telegram. Though this is still up for debate, in reality, the events most likely went as follows. Lee's lost orders were found at about noon, as previously confirmed by one of McClellan's unit commanders, and the orders most likely reached McClellan by 3 p.m. At 3, McClellan then ordered his cavalry chief to verify that the orders were legitimate and not a Confederate trick, which he had to do. Simultaneously, we know that for a fact that McClellan had Burnside's knife corps on the move at 3:30 p.m., and these men filled the road west to Lee's rear guard at South Mountain, well into the night. At about 6:20 p.m., McClellan began to issue his orders for the rest of the army to move, with most units being instructed to begin marching at 3 a.m. While all this is going on, at midnight McClellan telegraphed Lincoln to let him know what the army was doing. By 9 a.m., the first Union troops climbed South Mountain and met Confederate rearguard. By nightfall, McClellan's army forced Lee to take a defensive position along the Antietam Creek. McClellan pursued Lee, and within 48 hours, the Battle of Antietam officially started, which eventually forced Lee back across the Potomac River. I don't know about you, but that doesn't really sound like McClellan was messing around. In reality, it sounds like he took the necessary precautions to ensure that the orders were legitimate, and then had his troops marching basically as soon as they could. Another aspect of the Battle of Antietam that we need to consider is how I believe historians have deeply underestimated the strength of Robert E. Lee's army. Most historians claim that McClellan had about 87,000 men, while Lee had about 40,000. However, what is not mentioned is how every historian count is basically just an estimate, because Lee's army did not have an official count cited until his returns were cited on October 10, 1862. In reality, Lee filed his first return 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, and the count he had was 36,418 infantry, while the count also misses cavalry and artillery units, which would most likely have brought the count to a little over 41,000 at the end of the campaign. Though Lee admitted that these counts were, quote, very imperfect, what is really fascinating, though, is when Lee did his official counts on October 10th, he showed 64,273 soldiers present for duty. I know what you're thinking. Lee probably just got a couple thousand more troops over the next month while marching, but that can't be true because Lee had not received a single new regiment to replace his losses because the Confederate draft laws at the time already pulled every eligible man into the army by the summer of 1862. So, now that it is established and you consider Lee's reported campaign losses, this would mean that Lee started the campaign with a minimum of 75,000 men. There have been many eyewitness accounts supporting the 75,000 Confederate soldier theory, one of which was Dr. Lewis Steiner, who was in Fredericksburg, Virginia, from September 10th through the 11th while most of Lee's army marched out of town. According to accounts, Dr. Steiner saw 69,000 Confederate troops, but also noted that he did not see any cavalry. Moreover, Dr. Steiner did not see a division, which we know was south of Lee. Conservatively, this would mean Lee had over 75,000 men, so now let's consider this with McClellan having 87,000 men and Lee having 75,000. So you're telling me McClellan is going against one of the greatest generals in the Civil War with untrained soldiers and the pressure of Lincoln on his back? It kind of makes sense why he didn't dominate Lee like we thought he should have. On September 17, 1862, General George McClellan halted Robert E. Lee's first Confederate invasion of the North after the Battle of Antietam. Though the battle itself was a draw, the Lincoln administration was able to spin the battle as a win to gain necessary support for the war in the upcoming 1862 midterm elections. Even with the results at Antietam, the Democrats were still able to gain 30 seats in the House of Representatives and simultaneously took over the Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois state legislatures. Throughout the war, rumors swirled that there were going to be pro-Confederate militia groups that could potentially commit military coups in these states. So just imagine how much worse it would have been if McClellan would have lost the Battle of Antietam. Without McClellan's sort of kind of victory at Antietam, the Democrats could have easily won more seats in this election, effectively making Congress ineffective for the duration of the war. But that's another thing I want to touch on, which was McClellan's political career, which brings me to Part 3. Part 3. The election of 1864. I know what you're thinking. Are you kidding me? How can you defend McClellan for his presidential run? He literally ran against one of the best presidents in American history. Well, yes, it is true that McClellan did run against Lincoln. Lincoln barely served his second term in office, and therefore we need to look at McClellan not in the context of Lincoln versus McClellan, but in the context of Andrew Johnson versus George McClellan. To start off with, there's a common misconception that George McClellan would have ended the Civil War if he were to be elected president. This is vehemently untrue, as in his acceptance letter at the 1864 Democratic Convention, McClellan declared that he would not accept peace with the Confederacy unless the Confederacy would rejoin the Union. This stance conflicted with the official Democratic Party platform, which stated, quote, immediate efforts be made for an end of hostilities with a view to an ultimate convention of the states or other peaceful terms, to the end that at the earliest practical moment peace may be restored on the basis of the federal union of the states. Basically, they said that they want peace and not the union to be intact. This stance was so controversial for many Democrats that many Northern Democrats ceased campaigning for McClellan for a little bit. What we also do not consider is how even if McClellan was elected, he would not take office until February of 1865, and Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse took place on April 9th of 1865. This means that as long as McClellan did not surrender immediately after taking the oath of office, that the Union still would have won the Civil War. What we do not know, though, is how McClellan would have handled Reconstruction, but by his 1864 platform, we can get a general idea of it. The first glaring issue in McClellan's platform is how he did not run on the abolition of slavery, but two things need to be considered. One, the president actually has nothing to do with the amendment process, so McClellan's opinions on the matter really doesn't matter with the Republican supermajority in the House and the Senate, which got elected in 1864. And number two, Congress passed the 13th Amendment on January 31st of 1865, which would have been in Lincoln's lame duck period. Though it could be argued that Lincoln would not have been able to persuade the 38th Congress of the United States to pass the 13th Amendment because the House of Representatives was made up of 39% Democrats and 4.9% of Unionists, but at the very least, the 13th Amendment would have been passed in the 39th Congress, and as mentioned prior, it had a Republican supermajority. My evidence is simple. In the 39th Congress, Republicans controlled 70.3% of the House of Representatives and 75.9% of the Senate. What many do not even consider is during the 39th Congress, southern states did not have congressional representatives, and states like Mississippi and Virginia did not have representatives until the 41st Congress. So, simply put, the House could have easily passed the 13th Amendment and the other slavery amendments. Now, I know what you're thinking. What is stopping these states from blocking the 13th Amendment? Well, in our timeline, states would not receive their congressional delegation again until they ratified the 14th Amendment. So, in this scenario, Republicans would demand that the 13th and 14th Amendments be ratified before the southern states receive their congressional delegations back. The worst case scenario is McClellan is a lame duck president who will get overruled by his Republican supermajority Congress all the time. In my opinion, I personally think if McClellan did not play ball with the Republican supermajority, they just would have impeached him and his vice president as well. On what charges, I don't know. If I'm being honest, it would probably be pretty frivolous charges, which could set a dangerous precedent for American history. But the moral of the story is, in this scenario, the president pro tempore of the U.S. Senate, Benjamin Wade, would have become the president, and the Republican Reconstruction Plan would be back in action. And before you say Congress already attempted to impeach Johnson, which is true, we also have to keep in mind that Johnson was saved by one vote. So a vote against McClellan could have easily gone either way. It is likely that Grant would still be elected president in 1868, and he'll be elected without the terrible policies of Andrew Johnson. And certainly it needs to be said that McClellan did not hold sympathies for the South, which could not be said for Andrew Johnson. President Andrew Johnson was way worse than George McClellan, and I'm saying that as a North Carolinian. To open it up, let me give you a simple quote in 1866 that Andrew Johnson wrote. Quote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." So let's review what Andrew Johnson did as president. Well, for one, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which Congress overrode, which they would probably override stuff like that for McClellan's presidency. Simultaneously, since Johnson was a Southern Democrat, he did virtually nothing to stop Southern Democrats from regaining power in the South. A huge part of this was doing nothing about the KKK's rise to power in the American South. To make matters worse, the KKK was founded in his home state of Tennessee. I know how racist and terrible McClellan was, but under no circumstances would he allow a veto military group to rampage through America's South. I also could not find anything on McClellan doing egregious acts to African Americans during his time as New Jersey's governor, but honestly, I found limited information about this, so I could be wrong. But what do you think? Do I make a compelling argument for George McClellan, or was he just a bad Civil War general and I'm just barking up trees? As always, remember to like and subscribe and let me know in the comment section below who I should defend next. Thanks, guys.